Hello, and welcome to Change the Face of Yoga, teaching toddlers through golden oldies. I'm very excited to be talking to lots of yoga teachers who will explain their passion for teaching yoga to students with different ages, physical fitness levels, wellness levels, and different goals. They will explain the benefits of yoga for these students and will be including teacher tips and pose modifications. I am Stephanie Cunningham of Yoga Lightness, and I've been teaching over 50s for 10 years. So this area is my passion and the passion of many other yoga teachers that you will be listening to in this series. Thank you so much for listening, and let's get started. This is episode 27 of Changing the Face of Yoga, and our guest today is Katie Overcash, who is a clinical social worker and works with people who have PTSD and complex PTSD. She's going to talk to us about the partnership that yoga teachers and yoga therapists can have with clinicians to help people who are dealing with trauma. Hello. I'm very excited to have Katie Overcash here again. Katie's last podcast was extremely popular, and it was about a subject that we've looked at in several different ways, but it's about trauma. And what Katie is going to talk about today is what are the differences between what a yoga instructor, a yoga therapist, and a clinician can offer someone who is suffering from trauma. And she has been offering teacher trainings to studios around where she lives on this subject, and also has taught in teacher training courses. She's really has a lot of expertise in this, and I think it will really help all of us to figure out where we fit in the spectrum of care for people who are suffering from trauma. Welcome, Katie. I'm so glad that you agreed to come back.
Thanks for having me.
Let's talk first of all about, what might be the causes of traumatic stress.
When we talk about traumatic stress, it can really be a lot of things. We can look at anything from, abuse, neglect, medical interventions, anything from, military-related war, things like that. Natural disasters, we've had several of those lately that could definitely cause people, traumatic stress, grief and loss, among many other things.
We have someone who has traumatic stress, and what does that look like in the body? What would we be looking for if we were teaching someone like that?
Yeah, so as yoga instructors and yoga therapists, what we're really looking to work with is a couple different parts of the brain. So we're really looking at this very primitive part of the brain that's at the back of the skull near the neck, that kind of brain stem and that first part of the brain, and then this limbic system, which is kind of in the middle. Us talk therapists are working at this frontal lobe, so this where all the higher level cognitive processes go. But housed within those two areas that we're working with when we're speaking of the body is the body's response to trauma. Someone goes through something traumatic, whatever that is. It comes through through their senses. So, kind of what they're seeing, what they're hearing, they're feeling, all those different things. But after all of that happens, it gets stored in the body. And a lot of my work and kind of my education has come from, there is a psychiatrist named Bessel Van Der Kolk. He has a research facility in Boston, and he wrote a book called The Body Keeps the Score. So basically his whole premise is that trauma really kind of gets stuck in the body, and then it hijacks the body. So it affects all these different areas that until things are worked out, maybe through yoga or other different body modalities, and with talk therapy, this person is still going to live in this trauma. So basically what I'm saying is, one thing that we talk about is there's something called hyper-arousal and hypo-arousal. So hyper-arousal would look like, a lot of anxiety, maybe a lot of anger or rage, that high level of energy. And then you've got hypo-aroused, which is that more kind of lethargic, maybe looks like depression, someone who's just kind of going through the motions, dissociated, disconnected, all of those things. So people who've gone through trauma will really kind of bounce back and forth between these two, so between hyper and hypo, and they're not really getting to spend much time, for very little time, in this area of comfort, relaxation, and peace. They're really kind of bouncing. So if you think about what life might look like there, pretty chaotic. They have a low heart rate variability. And what I mean by this is you've got your sympathetic nervous system, which we all kind of think about is the fight-flight mode, that stress mode. And then you've got your parasympathetic system, which is that rest and digest mode. People who've not gone through traumatic stress can go back and forth between these two, sympathetic and parasympathetic, in a very kind of healthy, appropriate way. For example, you're running late to an appointment and you're kind of in that stress mode, maybe there's a lot of traffic and you're going to be late and all of that. Well, you get there and you're able to, probably within a few minutes, calm down and kind of operate like you would, at an appointment any other day. Whereas for these people, they're probably going to get stuck maybe in that sympathetic nervous system. So that may happen to them and they're not able to really kind of come off of that stress mode for quite some time. So
why is that?
It's what the trauma does to the body. So it really kind of, they get stuck in that either fight, flight, sympathetic system or that freeze parasympathetic system because their body has been hijacked and is overtaken by the trauma and all the sensory inputs that they've gone through. So they're not able to kind of bounce back and forth between the two like our body's equipped to do. The memories and the sensations, like I said, kind of they're hijacked, their body's hijacked. The memories and sensations are stuck. So they're not able to always live their life in the present moment, and not that any of us really are, but they are much more so overrun by these memories and these sensations that happen during the trauma. So for them, once the trauma's over, it's not over. Their body is still living it, and their mind is still living it. If you look at our reference manual for diagnosing somebody's what us talk therapists will use, it's called the DSM. And there's a certain criteria that they have for someone who's gone through trauma. So not everybody who's gone through a traumatic stress will end up with the diagnosis, and we don't completely know why. There's some theories, but so someone who does meet that criteria for PTSD would have things like intrusions. So that would be, like I said, these memories that kind of come up maybe out of nowhere, or maybe something kind of triggers it. Maybe they're flashbacks, they're kind of picturing this event in their mind. Nightmares is big for this population. They would also, there's a lot of avoidance of things associated with that traumatic event. So if that's something like an internal reminder, so maybe a thought or a feeling would come up and they're really trying to avoid that because it's very painful and it brings up a lot of, maybe painful sensations and memories. But they're also avoiding external reminders. So maybe certain people or certain objects, activities that remind them of the trauma. They have a lot of negative kind of thought and mood symptoms that come up. So you may look at maybe a lot of shame, a lot of maybe fear, anger, things like that they kind of have a good bit of the time. And then lastly, we look at the alterations in arousal. So a lot of times for these people, they are hypervigilant, kind of constantly scanning the room, looking for just, kind of checking to see what's going on or if there's a danger coming, things like that. A lot of problems with concentrating, or maybe a lot of, irritable or aggressive behavior.
If we had someone in our classes that were showing some of these or all of these issues as yoga teachers or therapists, what kinds of things should we be doing?
So really what we, as a therapist, and in our world, a lot of times we're taught about competency. So only, in my world in talk therapy, I'm only going to treat diagnoses that I'm competent in, whether it's I've taken trainings or I have experience there. So I think for yoga therapists and yoga instructors is pay attention to your areas of competence. Same as you would not go and teach a power class if you're trained in gentle or restorative, those kind of things. Same thing for this is, if you're not a mental health therapist, then it is not your role to provide that talk therapy to that person if they're experiencing, one of these symptoms. Really, I think what we say is to support them before you do anything. And I think that a lot of times as people, we want to do something. We want to make someone feel better. And for these people, of course, we would like to do that as well. But we maybe are not trained in that, and we don't know how to, as a yoga instructor, as a yoga therapist, how to appropriately manage that. So, I think a lot of times when you're teaching a general population class or a class specific to people who've been through trauma, we're really looking at mindfulness, the breath, the body sensations, bringing them back to the present moment. We're not rushing over there and trying to get them to tell us about what their flashback is all about, or if they dissociated, kind of what was going on there. We're really just looking at reinforcing the present moment, the breath, and what they're experiencing or feeling in their body. I think that being supportive, holding that space, but also setting those boundaries that, if someone starts to go down that road of telling somebody about what happened to them, those kind of things, use your best judgment in being polite and caring and all of those things to let them know that you appreciate them and feeling comfortable and safe enough to let you know about those things. But then also, finding out if they've got maybe a therapist that they're working with, or if, making sure they have some sort of support when they leave your class, like if they're gonna, call a friend or maybe, go home to a loved one. And I do know a lot of yoga instructors that work with this population. Maybe they work with them at the VA, or maybe they work with, someone who is seeing a therapist. They have a release to speak to that therapist. So that yoga teacher could, talk to the person that experienced something in their class and say, hey, can I have permission to talk to your therapist about what came up? And that way the therapist can do that talk therapy and process it with them.
Okay, that sounds good. You use restorative yoga along with your talk therapy.
Yes.
I was pretty sure about that, but anyway. And what are the specifics so that a yoga therapist or a yoga teacher would know maybe some tips or what we should be doing if we think that we have someone who is in this space during one of our classes?
What you should be doing, like as far as what type of movements you should do, or what type of how to handle your class, or
I took a class and it was more the theory, shall we say, behind anxiety and depression, and I never got to the second part, which is what specifically within our scope of practice what we should be doing. And so I would like to know, should I kind of immediately tamp down the class and we all go into kind of a restful kind of movement or breathing or maybe a little mindfulness, or should I, do something different?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think cueing mindfulness, if you're teaching a truly trauma-sensitive class, our biggest thing is we want people to be in the present moment. They need that present moment because so much of their existence is maybe living in the past and fearing, threat and harm in the future. So we want to give them that gift of the present moment. So I think always cueing mindfulness and maybe even cueing, sometimes in my classes I'll cue, something with their senses, like when they're maybe coming out of Shavasana is notice a sound that you hear in the room, something like that. I think that, in cueing different body parts, right? Like maybe cueing this body sensation, you may feel this stretch, in your hamstrings, whatever. I think the other thing that's interesting is a lot of times in a trauma-sensitive class, you can design it to either be energizing, grounding, or centering. And if you look at that model that I talked about earlier of hyper-aroused, hypo-aroused, and then you've kind of got that area of peace in the middle. So if you notice that somebody, or maybe the class just comes in really and it seemingly to you is hyper-aroused, you could start cueing poses that would be more grounding. So in my restorative class, I would do things like child's pose or maybe a restorative twist. I've done a reverse shavasana before. Reverse shavasana, so I can do it several ways, but in my restorative class, you've got belly down. Sometimes I put blocks kind of right, your shoulders are kind of resting on those blocks. You've got a blanket on your forehead. Maybe you have a bolster that your feet are propped on, or maybe you don't even have those props. Maybe you're just belly down with your forehead on your hands stacked. But something, because you're really looking at trying to close off that energy and bring that energy down. So I look at a lot of poses that are, forward folds, or you're kind of, wrapped around a bolster, those kind of things. And then if your class comes in or people come in and you can see like they are, I wouldn't say dissociated, that could happen. Maybe that kind of deer in the headlights look, but maybe they're just not connected, maybe sluggish, tired energy in the room. You're going to do poses that are going to bring that energy up. So we want to give them energy, like maybe back bends. I'll do like a regular shavasana or basic shavasana for those people. And then those centering, poses, kind of keeping things where they are. So if people are not really either hyper-aroused or hypo, you may want to do something there. A lot of times, like a legs up the wall for me would be something more centering.
All right. It's really being in tune with your class and knowing kind of where they are before you can start figuring out what's the best design for this particular class. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, and I think the more that you obviously teach your students and you get to know them, you'll kind of notice these things. And you can't necessarily tailor a class to one person, because one person might be more energetic and another person might be more sluggish. So maybe you just do some trauma sensitive classes will kind of combine all three. So it does kind of hit all of those for people, or they have a kind of mentality of meet people where they are. So meet them, if they are energetic, you meet them there with, back bends and things like that are gonna, or if it's a flow class, something more warrior poses, more, energetic stuff. And then you may end up doing some things, bringing them to the floor and doing some forward folds and things like that. And then maybe something more centering, like, some seated pranayama, like in a comfortable seat type poses.
When you're teaching potential teachers in the teacher training courses, what are the three things that you would want them to come out of that course, of that part of your course with?
Yeah, I think that when you're thinking about, I want them to have the education, obviously, of what trauma does to the body and what life looks like for these people. And then I want them to be cognizant of, or just being sensitive to all of that when they're tailoring their classes. But I think that if you think about trauma, when the trauma is happening, there's a lack of safety, predictability, and control. If that's what happens during the trauma, and then if someone ends up with the diagnosis and they're living with all these reminders of the trauma, life for them is lacking safety, predictability, and control. Maybe they never know when they're going to have a nightmare or a flashback, or they don't feel like they're in control of their body and their life because of all this stuff. So that's one of the biggest things of when you're, either you're a yoga therapist or a yoga instructor, is creating a environment where these people can have safety, predictability, and control.
So they know what's going to happen pretty much when they walk into class.
Yeah. So I've done this recently, is I'm playing the same music every single time, because now people they're just expect it, and that feels good to them. Like, oh, I know what's gonna happen there. Some yoga instructors will wear the same outfit every time they teach. Maybe they teach the same sequence. So having that kind of predictability there, and knowing that this is going to be an hour-long class, and we're going to do some of these poses, and these poses. I think with the control part is letting them have autonomy, that choice to, okay, you can do this pose, or you can do this pose, or you can do this pose or not do any pose. But giving them choices, I think, is a huge part of trauma-sensitive yoga class, is, making them feel like they're more in control. during the trauma and even living with the trauma, life, they don't feel like they're in control. We want to give back control to them. And then safety, right? So they felt unsafe during the trauma, but a lot of times people develop these worldviews after a trauma, like the world is unsafe or people hurt me. And so we really want to give them a place where they can feel safe, and it's kind and it's gentle. You can explore your body. I'm going to be a friendly teacher. I'm not going to be judgmental if you don't do a certain pose or you come out early or whatever.
Really, this is just very similar to what you would do anyway in a class, which is, be really aware of where your students are and to provide consistency. I mean, it's a couple of steps beyond. I don't wear the same outfit every time, but
yeah.
I'm really into giving them choices and hopefully providing a kind and gentle and safe place for them. So that makes me feel better. Then at least I have a few tools that I already do and already use that would be helpful to someone who's got some of these traumatic issues. This makes me feel much better. I've done so much trauma podcasts, I was getting very nervous about it. So this makes a lot of sense to me. I can understand how I would do that. I just want to really emphasize, though, that our scope of practice allows us to do these kinds of things, consistency in our classes and giving them choices and providing a safe, kind, gentle place. But we do need to be aware that they may need more intense help, and that someone who's been trained in this should maybe someone that we want to have on our referral list.
Absolutely. I think that like the studio where I work, I have told all of the teachers there, and we have a Facebook group where we communicate with each other, but I have told everybody there, if something comes up in your class and you would like to talk about that with me, you're welcome to do that. You're always welcome to use my name and give that to the person. I may not be the best fit, but I can help them locate another therapist. So I think if you're specifically doing this work, if you're linked up with the VA, or if you're linked up with maybe a recovery center or mental health agency or something like that, there's going to be a therapist, kind of baked into that situation for you. But if you are teaching a regular class and maybe stuff like this comes up, I think it's always good to have a resource for referral. Or even, like, I'm part of the Veterans Yoga Project in Charlotte, and it's all over the United States, but I'm part of the group here in Charlotte, and they also use me as the mental health ambassador. So if something were to come up in one of their classes and they needed a way to decompress from that, or they needed maybe some, a therapist kind of view or perspective on that, they can come to me. So I think that's always a good piece of advice. And then I think also connect yourself to other people who are doing this work. So if there's if you do have a passion for working with people who've gone through traumatic stress and helping them, in part of this healing process, connect with other people, connect with therapists that are doing this work, and connect with other yoga instructors. Maybe even, if there's people who are doing acupuncture for this population or whoever, but have that little community for yourself so that you don't feel isolated. You feel like you've got that support system to help you if, something were to come up in a class.
Okay. That's excellent advice. And there are quite a few. I just did a podcast last month about this woman who started these free classes for people that are refugees who have definitely suffered trauma and perhaps tortures. There are these resources around, and so I would certainly suggest that if you are interested in this, that you do get into a community.
And I think also just with anything, whatever you're into in life in general, but as yoga therapists or yoga instructors or whoever, is constantly learn. I'm always reading a book, and my website has lots of my book reviews. I just read a book and then I type up a little blog post, and so I'm constantly reading books. I'm constantly looking at, or going to trainings and things like that. Is just keep learning, because there's, especially with trauma and the brain and mental health and yoga too, there's always new stuff coming out. So I think kind of keeping yourself curious with all of that.
Yes, I agree. It's excellent. Is there anything you would like to finish with before I tell everyone how they can contact you or see what you're doing lately if they'd like?
I think the last piece and I think helping yoga instructors and yoga therapists feel important and very special in the work that we're doing as talk therapists is where you kind of fit in with all of this. So a lot of times, or back in the day, people kind of, when they were thinking about helping people with trauma, especially as talk therapists, we were thinking about just talking to people. And if we just talk to them enough, then this trauma memory won't be so scary, or it'll file itself away, and then it won't be intrusive anymore. But and that's called a top-down treatment modality. But like Bessel Van Der Kolk, who I mentioned earlier, he operates from this bottom-up modality, and there's a researcher back in, the late 1800s and early 1900s named Pierre Genet, who came up with this 3-step process for healing trauma, and a lot of people still use that to this day. That first step is stabilization. So as a talk therapist, I am working, and I have 2 roles. So when people come to my office, I can kind of do both at the same time. But if I'm a talk therapist that does not have the yoga background that I do, I'm going to be, getting to know my client and things like that. And then also helping them, that first stage is helping them gain skills, that self-regulation, all those tools. So hopefully a lot of those therapists are referring people out to, get for yoga or any other type of body modality. Maybe it's acupuncture. It doesn't matter, whatever. But yoga is really important. That's our first step, is getting people the tools to self-regulate. So that, the breath work and the mindfulness and all that body movement. And we really need that to be super strong and to be really solid for these people before we move into the second stage, which is where we are doing our talk therapy stuff with them. We're revisiting those trauma memories. We're trying to file away those memories so that they're no longer coming up randomly during the day for these people. So just letting yoga instructors and therapists know how important they are to what we're doing. If you guys, or me too, but if we weren't around, or if yoga instructors weren't there, it would be very hard to bring these people back to that trauma memory, because then they would drop out of therapy, or maybe they would harm themselves and things like that. So this is a really important first step for our clients. And then our last step, which also I feel like for me, yoga kind of also encompasses, it's reintegration. So we're trying to get people back connected to other people, getting them to create a community for themselves, which I think is a group class. If you start going to a group class a couple times a week or every week, you've got this built-in community, and that's what we want for our clients as well. So yoga kind of is that bookend support in the trauma work that we do.
That's great. I love that. Really, yoga instructors, yoga therapists have a really important role in the process. We are not the entire process, but we have a role that's critical, or could be critical. One way to do it anyway.
Yeah, it's very, very important. And so especially if you're operating from this bottom up, or you're following Bessel Van Der Kolk's work, yoga is highly important.
Okay. So did Bessel Van Der Kolk actually suggest that you use yoga, or just that you use movement?
Yeah, no, so his book, Body Keeps the Score, is a wonderful book. The first part is all about trauma and kind of what it does to the brain and what it does to the body. And then the last part of the book, he's a psychiatrist, and he started back in when PTSD was first getting an official name. And he has now moved away from prescribing drugs, or medications. I think he still will from time to time. But the last part of his book talks about, here are things that the research has proven, what I do at my research center to help people heal from trauma. And yoga has its own chapter. So, and he's got, I don't know, maybe there's 7 to 10 different things. Each has a chapter, but yoga is one of them. So I think that's pretty powerful, and he's a big supporter of yoga.
Right. Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Okay. Well, Katie, I'm so glad that you came back. You've given us just incredible information and very helpful for instructors out there. And I'm sure you've piqued some interest of some of our instructors and therapists to work in this area. So if you are interested in Katie's work, she's at Overcashtherapy on Facebook and Instagram. She is a licensed clinical social worker and a 200-hour registered yoga teacher. So she is in the perfect position to put those two things together. So thank you, Katie. You've done,
Thank you.
Once again, an excellent interview, and I really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for that wonderful interview. If you would like to be a guest on Changing the Face of Yoga, please go to my website, www.yogalightness.com.au, and under the Changing the Face of Yoga tab, you can complete Be Our Guest form. After reviewing the form and finding it applicable to this podcast, we will send you a link to schedule an interview. Please download, review, and tell your friends of any podcasts that are of interest to you and to them. If you would like to contact me, send an email to info@yogalightness.com.au. And thank you for listening to Changing the Face of Yoga.